All right, we are about to get started. It's amazing. Most people signed in the last 60 seconds. And that's why we wait till 10:05. All right, let's begin. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another webinar, which we are now calling Animal Health Insights, thanks to all of you. We actually did a poll a couple of webinars ago, and this narrowly eked out Animal Health Hour, which is the one that I wanted to vote for, but I had to give the people what they wanted. Today, we're going to be talking with Randolph Legg on real-world evidence beyond the trial, why animal health needs real-world evidence. This is a very hot topic in the world of human health, and so we're excited to see somebody who has come from that background to provide some guidance for us on how to think about it today in animal health. So I'll introduce Randolph in a second. I'm very excited to have him join us. Thanks, Randolph, for joining. Couple housekeeping items. So we would love for you to guide this webinar. My favorite webinars are the ones where I ask very little questions. So I'll obviously kick it off. I think many of you know the drill by now. I'll kick it off with some questions. We'll get to know Randolph. And then at any point, please feel free to ask a question in the prompt, and I will always prioritize your questions over mine. And of course, your surveys participation is extremely helpful in guiding future guests, future topics, things you like, things you don't like. So please be open and honest there. And of course, check your email for more opportunities. And then lastly, this session will be recorded. Our next webinar, keep an eye out. Our next Animal Health Insights webinar will be with Marie-Paul Lachad, who actually started the very first European animal health CRO and is an early pioneer in the space. And we'll be talking about the placebo effect in veterinary medicine, interpreting clinical study results in placebo-controlled studies. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And let's get into it. Hello, Randolph. Welcome.
Thanks, Tommy. Good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. So Randolph is the CEO of In the Bowl Animal Health and serves on the board of Pet Flavors. He has more than 25 years of experience in human health and animal health, primarily with Boehringer Ingelheim. He began his career in BI's human pharmaceutical business, where he'd held a series of commercial leadership roles, supporting product launches and leading sales and marketing organizations across multiple therapeutic areas. His work included commercial strategy, market access, and cross-functional leadership. He later transitioned to BI's animal health division, where he led the U.S. pet veterinary business and later served as the head of the U.S. commercial business and U.S. president. In those roles, he was responsible for U.S. commercial strategy, sales, marketing, and customer engagement across the company's animal health portfolio. And then In the Bowl Animal Health, he leads the company's overall strategy and operations, focused on developing and commercializing solutions for the vet market. All right. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you, Randolph, and I know everyone here is too. So why don't we start and just tell us a little bit about your background and what led to your path into animal health?
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I'll start with the headline. I wish I would have come to animal health sooner, as I was a bit late in my career, but happy to still be working in animal health. But to answer the question directly, most of you, I hope, are familiar with Boehringer Ingelheim, a global human and animal health company. And I was fortunate to start my career at Boehringer and then spend 31 years in total at Boehringer across human and animal. And as Tommy mentioned, most of my roles were pure commercial roles focused on the customer, either through sales, marketing, or managed markets. I've also spent time as head of U.S. operations for our human pharma business, which led to my transition to animal health. Most of you are probably aware that Boehringer acquired Marielle. And when that acquisition occurred, it was, at least on the animal health side, a very small Boehringer animal health business, absorbing a very large Marielle animal health business. And anytime you integrate two companies of equal size is challenging. And I can tell you, bringing Marielle and the business size and scale that it had into Boehringer Animal Health at the time was challenging. And so our CEO at the time brought me and others into the operational challenge that we were facing. And that's my first exposure to animal health. And after that exposure and successful integration of Marielle, I stayed as the head of the pet business, transitioned to head of the commercial business, and ultimately assumed the president role across all functions in the U.S. For the last several years. So I did think I might journey into a quieter time in my life last year, April, when I transitioned from Boehringer. But after a few months of quiet time, I realized that I was not ready for retirement and started consulting. Joined the board of Pet Flavors, a company in Florida that provides palatants, flavorings, bitter blockers, and others for pet medicines. And then was fortunate enough to join In the Bowl Animal Health and Mountain Group Partners, focused on bringing the first medicated prescription dog food to market, which we're in the final stages of that process. So happy to be here, Tommy. Look forward to getting into this topic, which since my days in human pharma has been a focus, and I'm happy to share the process so far in animal health.
Awesome. Every time you try to get out, they'll pull you back in from retirement, right? I've heard that
Well,
story many
I've only
times.
tried once, but we'll see how it goes in the future.
Yeah, I have many friends in the same situation. Um, okay. Well, first question is, tell us, were there any major surprises when you moved over from human health to animal health? Like, what are some of the major differences? And did anything surprise you when you came over, or was it quite similar?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of similarities. But to your question on what surprised me, it was the concentration of business, and it's gotten even more concentrated since I came over in 17, 18. Um, in human pharma, I did the math once. There were close to 100 companies that equaled the top four or five, if you include IDEX, in terms of concentration of companies in the business. So the scale of what you work with in human pharma in terms of investments, in terms of research opportunities, in terms of partners to do, trials and research and other things, it's just much, much larger. And so as I joined animal health, it felt like a bit of a family, if you will, because after about a year, you get to know almost everybody involved in animal health from different companies. You find that almost every person has been absorbed from some merger somewhere. And I had a chance to join, for example, Novartis Animal Health reunion by accident last week at WVC, and that's a special thing about animal health is there's just a lot of passion and a lot of focus that you get on animal welfare in this case that doesn't always come through as cleanly in human pharma. And this isn't a human pharma focused webinar, but I could speak for a long time on what I think we could do better in human pharma now that I've seen what works well in terms of that focused energy that I see in animal health.
Yeah. I just found out this industry existed when I joined Prelude about 7 years ago, and I have yet to meet somebody in this space that I don't get that I don't like, that I don't get along with. They are just incredibly friendly and welcoming. I feel like almost an adopted brother or son of this small town. Not the same feel in human health. I
Uh,
will be honest on the human
yeah, I
side.
wasn't going to
Met
go
a lot
there,
of great
but
people over
yeah,
there, but definitely met a lot of people I wouldn't, I'd be okay not seeing again.
yeah.
Um, okay, well, let's get into the topic a little bit. Um, so how did the human health experience, well, first, why don't you introduce the topic? What is real world evidence? What's your experience with it? What are they doing on the human side? And how do we think about it on the animal side?
Yeah, so I'll give a little background. There was a point in time that I wasn't sure what real world data and real world evidence are, what the difference was, and what the heck, why was it so important? For years, it wasn't a big topic in human pharma. And when I came to animal health, it seemed to be not much of a topic at all. Uh, but to back up, and my first introduction was around the COX-2, COX-1 debates. For those of you that may remember, Vioxx was a Merck product that was removed from market. Boehringer had a product that we fought for more than a year to get a COX-2 label and were denied by the FDA, and we were deemed COX-1 sparing. We thought it was the worst possible outcome from a regulatory process ever, and it turned out to be the best possible outcome once questions around the safety of COX-2s came in. So science is funny sometimes, and what happened there is there were a lot of questions around, what are the true challenges and safety issues that exist with the COX-2s, and how are other products different, whether they be traditional NSAIDs or otherwise. And so that started a lot of the, I would say, commercial and research and development collaboration in my history of thinking through, how do we start to work with, our largest customers. And about the same time is when you saw massive integration of health systems. And so all of us, at some point will be treated by a health system, and really that evolution from the 90s to the 2000s till now has accelerated quickly, and we've seen a little bit of that on the animal health side. And I'll certainly explain the differences and similarities. Um, but those large companies, if you will, with thousands and thousands of physicians and patients, and obviously the care model that includes payers on the human side, lots of questions existed around the value of products post approval, and how do they impact health outcomes, and what type of data were we capturing to understand that? Because in a clinical trial setting, I'll use the word antiseptic. It's a very antiseptic environment, and it's meant to be that way, and it has to be that way primarily for safety. But you're also capturing basic efficacy questions, and speed to market is also one of the most important factors when you start to run clinical trials because of the cost, and obviously you're working in a zero revenue environment until you're approved. So you don't do large scale evidence generation trials that could span beyond what's the indication you're pursuing. Those obviously come post approval and add to the label as time goes on. So that's what drove a lot of the questions, and from the COX-2 questions to blood pressure control. There suddenly were literally hundreds of options to control blood pressure, and as newer options came to market, there were questions about were they any better than some of the original medicines that had been out for many, many years. And so I also had a chance to partner with the R&D organization to look at, continuous blood pressure monitoring, and what's the effect on observing blood pressure for 24 hours over time for patients. And then what are some of the health outcomes that we could start to predict or look at through evidence generation with our health system partners primarily. So real world data, to kind of maybe end on that, is a pretty basic concept that I hope everyone probably knows, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's the data that's generated from mutual care. You visit the doctor, they collect data, blood pressure, weight, glucose levels, whatever the case may be, and that patient record file, whether it be an animal or a human, is the real world data, if you will. The real world evidence comes from the analysis of those data, the collection of the data and the application to an outcome. and a hypothesis of what the health outcomes may be from the continued treatment of an animal with a certain type of modality. So that's a little background, and maybe I'll end with Tommy. The ultimate real world evidence and real world data environment that has come to light, and that is the advance of the treatment of diabetes. We're only 15 years into realizing that diabetes has a profound impact on cardiovascular health. And some of the unintended data capture from trials started to show an impact on weight loss. It started to show an impact on blood pressure, started to show an impact on cardiovascular disease incidence, and then ultimately cardiovascular death and death from all causes. And so, from DPP4s to SGLT2s to GLP1s, you started to see this evolution of medical questions evolving that I feel like is the best example of what real world evidence can do for human health, and the application for animal health follows very closely.
Fascinating. I have heard about the GLP-1, how it was sort of just a unexpected finding in some of these trials that question how so there's a lot of R&D folks on the call who are in sort of the trenches managing trials, thinking about ways to accelerate trials to enhance the likelihood of success, get data any way they can. How you mentioned sort of there's the EHR systems that humans use, that data is being collected every time you go to a doctor. On the human side, do you have some sense of how the data being collected in a real world environment is being interwoven with sort of the R&D pipelines? Is this something that people do on the post-market side? Who handles this? How do they get the data? Walk me through sort of the logistical of getting that data and using it for insights and who's involved.
Yeah, it's almost always in a phase 4 environment. So, the real focus is to do the traditional medicine development from research to development to through phase 3 and all the registration trials. And again, it goes back to, being on market and generating revenue. Now, the larger companies, of course, and this applies to animal health, have a lot more latitude in terms of how they design their trials, the path to market. But even in large companies, of course, there's extreme pressure on driving revenue with new innovation. And so getting to market and being approved is an important first step. And then you can start to think about, what does the phase 4 post-marketing world look like in terms of collection of data, new indications, presentation of clinical evidence. It doesn't always have to be an indication. The FDA doesn't have to be involved in many cases. It's nice when they are. And certainly partnering with the FDA CVM as it relates to animal health is important here, because if you do want to update the label, or you do want to use evidence to expand indications, it's important to have that alignment with the FDA up front and on an ongoing basis. But truly speaking, you can do phase 4, post approval studies, independently, and in many cases, it can be, annual updates through cohort analyses at scientific congresses. And in human pharma, that was a really big deal early on in the research related to cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And you were, having scientific sessions at the American Diabetes Association or the different cardiovascular societies to really look at the commingling, if you will, of these two disease areas. And so I think, to your question, Tommy, there's a much broader opportunity to generate real world evidence post approval, because you now have a medicine integrated into the environment, whether it's a large group of veterinary clinics, whether it be, general usual care in veterinary medicine, or of course in human pharma, it's now a medicine used broadly in many cases in health systems, which then gives you the real world data to generate the real world evidence from and to design protocols on. Because without that, you're kind of still in a back to my word, antiseptic environment with a traditional, registration study.
We have a first question. What is the biggest challenge you see right now in getting real world evidence incorporated into animal health?
So the data environment. I was naive when I came here. I assumed that the data environment would look much like it does in human pharma, and in human pharma, you've got part of it is due to obviously, and you referenced the HRs. There were billions of dollars appropriated to design patient data collection environments from the federal government. So we went overnight to having a very decentralized data model in human pharma to a very centralized data model, albeit restricted with a lot of HIPAA and other data related requirements that are more directly applied in human versus animal. But when I came to animal health, I learned that the data environment is very disconnected. And even in large scale vet clinics, which the names very well, they none of them have an ability to manage data from a centralized part. Some of them are developing integrated PIMS models where their data can be collected and managed, whether it be for revenue management purposes or health and clinical data purposes. But it certainly is years behind what you see, and I'll use UPMC, a large human health network in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Midwest area. You know, they were the leaders early on in investing in data, and now I can probably name dozens and dozens of health systems on the human side that have now invested the money along with the investments in the electronic health records to have usable data across their environments that help them manage costs, help them, understand the health outcomes, how those outcomes relate to cost and the value model. And that's another term we haven't used here yet, but the value model is a slight nuance of real world evidence in, I call it a subset, in where you start to look at what's the impact on the cost of care with the use of certain medicines. And that could be from clinic visits, it could be from more expensive therapies needed along the progression of disease. And you can do the same in animal health. And heart failure and heart disease and cardiovascular disease is a good example in animals where we know the cost of care increases dramatically for pet owners as I'll use dogs in this example, progress from early stage disease to late stage disease. Specialty care comes into play. And so a lot of this is dependent on a data environment where you can track it and manage it and understand it and start to give better advice to pet owners to bring it back to animal health on where to seek the best care, but also how to treat earlier in the disease and why that's important later on to the health of the animal, to the cost of care. But again, it's a little more challenging because the data is not so transferable. And even within a single clinic, most staff aren't well trained in how to use the data. It's just a data input model, and quite frankly, a data model that used for documentation for purposes that may never be present. I'll pause there, and I could speak for a long time on this because it was certainly one of the most noticeable differences when I came to animal health, coming from human farming.
So I want to pull this thread a little bit more. This is very enlightening. So I'm trying to visualize in human health, you have all these different EHR systems, and you're saying there was some element of integrations. But the sites have learned how to aggregate each individual clinic's data into a central repository. Is it in the EHR? Is it pulled into some other pool? And then how would that look on the animal side then? How do we help the animal folks kind of get
Yeah,
get aligned?
yeah, good question. And so on the human side, I'll quickly say, and I'll use a couple of names. The Mayo Clinic environment, for example, the Kaiser Clinic environment, UPMC I mentioned, Geisinger, another historically well integrated group. The Cleveland Clinic is another good example because while their name is Cleveland Clinic, they exist in Florida and the Middle East, and they've become global experts in cardiovascular care and many other areas. So there was a real need to ensure that they had data integration across their environment. And that's what really drove, I think, a lot of the investment is cost of care. And are there ways to better manage patient flow and treatment options and selections as you start to track the impact of care over, different, patient groups? And I'll give you an example. The impact of treating patients on early stage diabetes medicines, let's use metformin as an example, versus now DPP4s, SGLT1s, GLP1s, and otherwise, the cost of care is exponentially higher with newer medicines. Is there an offset over time to progression of disease and more expensive care later in life for the use of these medicines? Well, the only way you start to determine that is a longitudinal study that's capturing data over time with good cohort analyses to say, this group of patients that were, only being treated on metformin and perhaps a DPP4, how do they compare to a cohort that was treated on SGLT2s or GLP1s independently or together? And how many of those patients develop cardiovascular disease? How many of those patients died from cardiovascular disease? How many of those patients had cardiac rehab costs that came into care? And human healthcare, you're able to track all this within a health system because they, to your point, have integrated it on top of the EHR, because they know that with millions of patients under care and with contracts with payers, there's an incentive there that doesn't exist necessarily in animal health because you don't have such a large payer environment, i.e. an insurance environment that you have on the human side. So there's not, I'll call it a checks and balances of health systems managing themselves like businesses, payers managing themselves from an investment perspective and health outcomes. And I realize that's a bit of a controversial topic in how that works today in society. But back to your question on how can we do this and better in animal, it's tough because the government is not as involved, payers aren't as involved. The government, for example, has a huge interest in Medicare population. The billions and billions of dollars that we pay as a society into treating Medicare patients, that's a huge opportunity to manage outcomes and to manage better care. And so there's investment opportunities. You don't necessarily have that in animal health because largely it's a cash pay environment and you're trying to translate better care into future costs, which pet owners aren't always thinking about. Now, if I can shift to production animal for a second, it's actually more applicable early on to production animals than it is to companion animals, which might be a bit of a disconnect to think about. But if you think about what production animal businesses are trying to control for, they're trying to control for early disease, they're trying to control for growth factors, feed conversions, they're trying to get animals to a healthy state and to a certain point in their lives or a certain weight or a certain production in terms of the output of milk and eggs and meat that can certainly be tracked and managed much more easily, usually because of the concentration of those companies and their data environments than you could do on the pet side. And so we often, and even I, and currently, work in a companion animal only business, but we often focus on pets in this regard. But really, production animals, you could see a benefit from a real world evidence generation to the business much more easily.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I have a question here, but it's aligned with a question from the audience. So they say on the human health side, vendors such as Datavant and many companies using AI and LLMs are vendors that can tap into the EMRs and EHRs and abstract millions of records quickly. How would we do this in the animal health with disparate data systems and in an industry that cannot afford the cost of Datavant's services?
There's the biggest challenge. So, IQVIA is probably the biggest name on the human side. They've built an entire business, used to be IMS, now IQVIA. They're I'd say the largest data aggregator, and now they've evolved into being a CRO for RWE trials because of what was just described. This data environment and data aggregation environment exist. absent of a philanthropic investment that would create a an above industry data environment, which I don't think will happen, it's going to have to rely on large aggregated production animal businesses or pet health businesses. So, I'll use a name here, which is familiar to everybody, the Mars company. They operate specialty clinics, they operate primary care clinics, they operate the largest number of clinics in the world and United States of any company. There's high motivation for a company like Mars to create an internal data environment, but it will be a Mars data environment, and most likely they won't share that data readily, except with sponsor initiated trials that they may partner on, for example. So I don't think the same motivation exists. And I mentioned the government a second ago. Without the government being involved, I think you also lose some of the transparency that comes with health outcomes data. That again, I go back to Medicare. Medicare is the single largest investment of a healthcare population in the world, and so that's a huge driver as you start to look at competing contracts for Medicare through payers and through health systems, and that's the business that human healthcare has become. And so, if you're a UPMC, you're fighting to keep contracts with payers and the government, and that's usually tied to health outcomes and certain types of offsets that come with improved care. And if you're not meeting certain criteria, you can lose funding and you can lose access to patients, which is the lifeblood of the revenue of your corporation. Animal health doesn't necessarily have that environment, so I think it's going to come down to companies seeking answers to key clinical questions that veterinarians care about, that veterinarian clinic companies that have aggregated care about, and of course the scientific community, researchers that are looking at the next wave of innovation in animal health. Some of this will come from real world evidence generation, answering questions that either prove the hypotheses or disprove the hypotheses and thus lead to other research. So I took that a couple of different directions, Tommy, but I think it's a challenge
Really great.
that's not
Really.
easily answered. And I think it's going to have to come, and I can use some examples in my own life when I first started approaching companies about doing RWE trials. I just had some of those meetings at WVC and VMX. It's not easy because not a lot of people are doing them on a large scale.
I want to well, I guess I'll pause because that was a lot of great content, and I'm actually genuinely curious on about 12 things you said. But I want to make sure I target what the audience wants. So I'm going to pause for 10 seconds if anybody has any questions, and then I'm going to just jump in because I'm really interested in all this. Okay. Being the practical thinker that I am, I've got like my solutions hat on, my entrepreneurial hat on, and I'm just thinking of all kinds of ideas. But I want to ask about viability of some of these. So it sounds like one of the biggest problems in adoption in animal health is the lack of incentive from a large organization like the government to, to get involved and to lead the efforts and or at least facilitate the efforts to adoption. FDA on the human side, they pay a huge amount of money. They want to save costs. So they're going to go out there and they're going to start figuring out, okay, how do we bring these costs down? Real world evidence is a clear opportunity to share data across the industry, across people, and we can use that data to make better decisions to then prevent healthcare. CVM doesn't pay as big of a bill. They don't have a sort of a Medicaid or Medicare for dogs or cats or cattle. But surely they do care about the health and well-being of their constituency. The whole reason CVM exists is to ensure drugs and products don't get to market to harm animals or take money for products that don't work. Do you foresee a path to gaining, whether maybe it's not monetarily, in their P&L, but do you foresee a path where industry can convince CVM to take a bigger involvement in this just for the sake of the welfare, or do you see angles What do you see as potential opportunities to get CV involved, or if you think it's going to be exclusively on the sponsors?
Yeah, I don't know CVM or even FDA on the human side is a necessary part of expanding, real world evidence. I think uh, because they're not necessarily controlling these trials and approving the data directly um, or protocols or otherwise, it's in their best interest to help support it. I'll say that, and largely in recent years, there's been no pushback, but they've got all they can handle now, and I can certainly attest to that in my current role. So adding this to the plate of CVM, I just don't know if that has any benefit in terms of accelerating or impacting the environment. They don't control the data environment. They don't control the clinics. There's not a link to funding that's related to health outcomes. I think it's going to come down to, and let me go back to kind of companion animal for a moment. You know, it's going to be, I think, one important outcome that we can start to look at, and that's the life of pets. We've heard this longevity term used, right? But it's really about, can I enjoy a pet with a quality of life longer, a high quality of life longer. And I think all of us with pets, and I've got one that look like the dog in my background. But if I told my family that treating our dog today, who's been diagnosed with renal cardiovascular challenges, that earlier intervention will lead to 5 years of higher quality life and in general lifespan. That's a huge driver. It's a private paid driver, but it's a health outcome that that could be generated through looking at earlier intervention and cohort analyses of usual care versus new care in terms of new modalities. So I think it's, and I'll use this term, it might be more of an emotional play for pet owners, and of course for uh, animal health companies. It's the extended time and revenue generation for keeping pets healthier. And I think, and I go back to this value model. I had a chance to build a value model for cardiovascular medicine. And that value model was dependent on two things. It was dependent on earlier diagnosis of cardiovascular disease in dogs. It was dependent on earlier treatment after earlier diagnosis, and then the collection of data that we could prove out over time, this is a in process example. Over time, do we see the benefits we think of that earlier treatment, earlier diagnosis in the lifespan of the dog and the quality of the life of the dog? And so, those type of things we didn't really have answers to. The data suggests that yes, that's what we think will occur. But in a usual care setting, our pet owner is going to be compliant and pay the money to treat their dogs for cardiovascular disease over time and earlier. Is that truly going to have an impact over time as we think, and what's that impact look like, and which data environment and which groups can we partner to start to generate those data? That was my original foray into real world evidence in animal health, was to design that real world evidence trial, which had a value component, which spoke to the vet clinic, which means, hey, you now get this dog longer in your environment, and every month of a healthy dog under treatment, there's a vaccine value, there's a treatment value, there's a dermatologic treatment value and percentage of dogs. All that adds up into a lifetime value, which speaks to the vet clinic side. But then for a pet owner, it speaks to quality of life and longer life. And then for a animal health drug company, it speaks to, instead of 7 years on average of treatment, it's now 10 years on average per dog, or 11 years or 12 years. And so that's where you get this value, this value model, which brings in all components of animal health across the pet owner, vet clinic, and company. And now that's when everyone gets interested. And I think that's what we're not yet getting to. And that was kind of my hypothetical model that I built and presented to several companies that I think is still in process now.
So if you were coaching a team, a lean team, they just got approval for their new drug, and they want to track it over time. They want to somehow maybe on a smaller scale, tap into real world evidence to help them make future R&D decisions on their product. What advice would you give them to set up sort of a minimal viable product with minimal viable RWE, and sort of like what roles, what process tools you think would be required to do that?
Yeah, good question. I'll start with real world evidence is dependent on commercial and R&D teams working together. It's the idea that the generation of new data answers health questions that have a financially positive outcome for our customers, positive health outcomes for our customers, i.e. pet owners, and obviously are sustainable to the business from an investment perspective. Because this isn't cheap, right? Running trials and in registration trials or post-approval trials, it's an investment. So that's step one is in any company, are the top executives in R&D and the top executives in the commercial organization, are they talking about these type of things? Because there were years that went by in human pharma where we overcorrected on the relationship between R&D and commercial, and it was almost seen within the same company as a forbidden conversation. And in the 2000s, back around the time again of the diabetes, new medicines, that's where I started to see R&D and commercial come back together and start to talk about, what are you hearing from these large health systems? What are their challenges in treating these groups of patients that, we know as decade and decade goes by, the number of patients that will be diagnosed with diabetes is exploding. And so that's what drove this original question. So back to your question, this first step, I think, has to be an organization thinking about, what can we generate from either a demonstration of value within a clinic or a demonstration of real world evidence that leads to outcomes for our customers that are beneficial to their business and ours. And without that mutual understanding, there's no motivation to move forward. If I'm allowed to mention two companies, we now, I think, have for the first time, two companies that are starting to advance their capabilities in this area. And so I mentioned Mars earlier, and that's one of them. They've developed a scientific team that's looking at generating evidence through clinical trials, including phase 4. And now there's a place to start the conversation within Mars. The other one is NVA and Ethos. And so I give both Ethos and Mars a lot of credit for hiring a new type of person into these roles, researchers, folks with a lot of experience running clinical trials, and now a place where companies can start to have meetings to ask mutual questions of products that are already being used by these organizations, and how can we have mutual goals to generate evidence that's, of course, useful outside of the independence of Mars and Ethos, but at least they're now, bringing their large-scale clinic environments, their large-scale data environments to the table for animal health companies to partner with to generate answers to questions they may have around their business and around health outcomes. So I think step two is getting those conversations started with perhaps those two companies, and maybe we see in the comments other examples. But so far, those are the two in my mind that have taken the right steps to create the right environment with the right scale to run these trials, and not just phase 4, but phase 3 as well. And then the last thing I would say is start to look at your pipeline, because we started making real world evidence. We started generating real world evidence questions before products even got approved. We had a strategy for phase 3, and then we had an immediate strategy for phase 4. And bringing those two timelines together is really important, because you start to generate a revenue stream based on what your phase 3 indication will be. But then you start to think about, how do you expand that indication? How do you expand the use of the medicine for the benefit of the patient? And what does that look like in terms of generating evidence in order to stimulate that type of decision by veterinarians in this case? And I'll leave it at those three, because I like three. But I think if you can start down that road, and maybe even I'll add to the first part when I mentioned the commercial and R&D organizations, You almost need agreement at that point that this is something your organization will invest in because it's a heavy lift. I remember the first time I had this conversation when I crossed over from our human team. Everyone was motivated when I approached them for the conversation, but everyone kind of looked at how do we get started? What do we do? And I was fortunate enough to have experience on the human side. And the first thing I did was bring all those R&D and research teams that I worked with on the human side over the aisle, if you will, to animal health, which had never happened before, and have a conversation and say, hey, this really experienced researcher from human pharma and this really experienced researcher from animal health have never even met and they work in the same company. And now let's talk about how we went from a traditional clinical trial environment to a real world evidence clinical trial environment to outcomes research to value models. And we just started sharing those experiences. And as you can imagine, really smart people in no time started to learn from the experiences of others. And we got up to speed really quickly.
Sounds like a really good conference idea for some conference entrepreneur out there. A human meets animal shared learning conference. Okay, we're coming up on time. I want to ask one more question for you. This has been just tremendous. I've definitely really learned quite a bit and really enjoyed this discussion. I think this is a critical topic now, and it will only get more, will only get bigger and more prevalent in the future. So let's fast forward 18 to 24 months. What would you say is sort of your bold prediction for animal health R&D and evidence generation, over that time?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that our scientific societies and meetings allow for more of a platform to present these type of data. And whether it's on the production animal side, which, I didn't mention this earlier, but a lot of real world evidence generation on the production animal side never leaves the farm. It's seen as proprietary, it's seen as unique, and there's a lack of willingness in animal health to share data like I saw in human pharma. And so I'm hopeful that in the future, the pursuit of excellence in medicine and outcomes supersedes the privacy and competitive concerns of companies and allows us to start to understand how to share best practices in evidence generation that leads to better business outcomes, better health outcomes, longer life for pets. Because that's what's going to make a difference. And every veterinarian that I've talked to, every researcher that I've talked to in animal health, when I have this type of conversation, they get excited thinking about the outcomes of certain presentations. And let's be honest, it doesn't always turn out the way you think. But no matter how it turns out, it's an incredible learning environment and starts to generate ideas for the next iteration of this evidence generation. But I think we're going to have to overcome this data environment. We're going to have to overcome this investment required. And how does the AVMA, for example, perhaps take a bigger role in partnering and in funding some of these things? I know that team well, and if they're listening, I'm not trying to take your money. I'm just trying to say how do we partner and how do we start to build an expectation for these type of studies as well, because you learn so much. And, all of us on this call have probably sat through, dozens and dozens of scientific presentations at different meetings. And, very few of those are focused on usual care. Very few of those are focused on the current clinic environment and real data that's generated in that environment. And to me, that's where, science meets real world. And we can do all the trials we want, but if it doesn't translate into improving outcomes, in business or health, we have to question, perhaps the value long term of those data. But I'm hopeful that's what we lean into in the future, and that some of these organizations, could be the ACVIM, it could be, to your point earlier, the government, getting more involved, which probably isn't very likely in the short term. But there's a lot of people in the world, I think, that that are looking at these questions, and you look at the Gates Society and other large scale philanthropic groups, they're starting to answer or ask a lot of questions that usually is focused on generating better health in societies outside the U.S. But I think the science we generate here can certainly apply to communities and countries around the world.
That's great, Randolph. That's great stuff. We did get one more. Somebody else snuck in a question here. Um, I think we've got a little bit of time. As a veterinarian and consultant, I love data, both favorable and unfavorable. However, generation of post-approval RWE involves risks as well as potential benefits to sponsors. As an executive, how do you convince company leadership, investors, and shareholders that the potential benefits outweigh the risks? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think it's, of course, highly dependent on the disease area you're focused on, and so that has been a question in my past. Um, and it's not on the animal side. To be fair, as I transitioned from Beringer last year, we had several of these that were advancing, and that question was a question, but never a question to stop the process. It was obviously a question to be sure that we have good pharmacovigilance, because good pharmacovigilance is important in phase 4 as it is phase 3 and other studies. And so that was, I think, more the reason of asking is how are we going to capture, questions around safety and product, questions that we don't intend to capture in this type of environment. So that was more the answer. But I think it's a really important question, especially as we start to get into cancer studies, for example. That's still an emerging area, both to costs and outcomes. If we're going to pay thousands of dollars per month to treat our animals for cancer, pets in this case, what data do I have to say that this leads to better health outcomes and a better quality of life and a longer life for my pet? We're early in those questions, but to the person's question, I think that's where you start to understand in very difficult treatment environments, there will be data collected that leads to questions around safety perhaps, or side effects or adverse events, and you have to collect it, you should collect it, and you should analyze it and understand it. But I think it's just a conversation you have internally that probably differs from if you're trying to treat animals in an environment looking at dermatologic conditions versus cardiovascular or as a case I just used cancer therapies.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. Please don't forget to fill out the survey. Thank you tremendously to Randolph Legg. What an awesome, awesome hour we spent together. I hope this spurs lots of internal discussions and thought-provoking ideas in the space. And I really do believe that this real-world evidence is a huge opportunity for animal health to just tie the whole circle together of R&D and commercial, and just get better data to help drive better decisions on which products to make and lasting effects of these products that are out in the market. So thanks so much, Randolph, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.